What exactly is e-safety? Well, in some way it depends on the context. It doesn't really have a formal definition, and in fact the term is starting to be phased out to a more defined term of online safety. The reason for the change is simply because the word online gives a greater scope and depth of meaning. E-safety is a term that's predominantly used in education in the United Kingdom. You don't really find it being used anywhere else in the world too much. So what does it actually mean? Well, firstly, e-safety is the umbrella term for a lot of things, but first and foremost in education, it's about safeguarding, not ICT. And because it's about safeguarding, then it's a whole school, all staff responsibility. We tend to talk about two key areas, behaviour and risk, and then we subcategorise these risks. For example, the behaviour will sometimes be due to not knowing or not caring or even not thinking. The risk is more specific. For example, sexting, which is a word used by adults to describe the act of taking and sometimes sharing sexually explicit material by a person under the age of 18. And so the behaviour is the act of taking part in this risky activity. We're going to be delving a little deeper into risk in another video, but for the moment just remember two key things. Firstly, risk is meaningless without context. Everything we do in life comes with an element of risk, whether that be crossing the road, driving a car, or sitting on a chair with a cup of tea. And being online is no different. And secondly, don't forget that risk doesn't mean harm. It's just an indicator based on many factors that something may or may not happen. So, what are these risks, or more accurately, what are the concerns? The specific risks are the subject of other videos, but very briefly, the safeguarding areas that everybody should be aware of are those such as child sexual exploitation, sexting, online or cyberbullying, and more recently, of course, radicalisation. And there are other areas as well, such as exposure to self-harming and pro-lifestyle websites, and many more, but for the moment, we're just sticking with the basics. But what about the concerns from children and young people themselves? Well, those areas that are arguably less harmful, but far more common. And these are areas such as being exposed to racist or sexual or violent content and endless, obtrusive and annoying advertising that spoils their gaming, their browsing and social networking experiences. And many other things which may be inappropriate and don't specifically come within the remit of safeguarding, but of course are very important. So speaking of inappropriate, what does that mean? Again, that's a word that needs context, as there is no real definition of what it is appropriate or inappropriate. That needs to be determined by the school or the parent, and that determination is usually in regards to the age, the maturity, or sometimes the additional needs of the individual. Study after study tells us that children of a younger and younger age have access to technology that has access to the internet. Devices such as iPads and Kindles and gaming devices like PlayStations and Xboxes. And indeed children of a younger age seem to be getting access to their own smartphones and now of course wearable technology such as smartwatches. So this means that the potential for exposure and risk is increasing. So simply teaching children facts does little by way of empowering them. For example, the whole concept of stranger danger on the internet is completely flawed and it's alarmist. Is it realistically possible to not talk to strangers online? So finally for this video, it's important we have a basic understanding of e-safety from a school and a home context, because there are pretty big differences between the two. So first of all, the home context. As I've said before, research is very clear that children of a younger and younger age are using devices that are connected to the internet. And I commonly refer to this as using technology as a nanny. In other words, giving the child a device to keep them occupied whilst busy parents are getting on with other things. Unmonitored, that child has access to a whole new world, something I refer to as the Narnia effect. And the child can either accidentally or on purpose access material that may not be appropriate. So the parenting aspect here is absolutely key, and again will differ dependent mainly on the age of the child, or whether they have any technical monitoring in place, whether they discuss issues and have an open, talkative relationship, or on the flip side, where there's no parental moderation whatsoever. Schools and others working with children have specific responsibilities, and as already mentioned, those responsibilities are safeguarding and of course the duty of care. But equally, we have to be mindful of the curriculum and any inspection criteria. You need to know what risk is, what the risks are in terms of the real world, not what you read in the newspapers, as often that's questionably sensationalist. You need to know what processes you have in place to respond to risk and how incidents are dealt with in school, and those areas will or should be within your policy. So that brings us to the end of this introduction video. In summary, we've had a very basic look at the two key areas, behaviour and risk. We've briefly mentioned some of the headline risk areas and also defined the home and the school context, and all of these areas will be covered in more detail later. In the next video, we'll be looking specifically at risk, i.e. what is risk and what are some of the risks. But in the meantime, here's a couple of discussion points. And if you're not in a group, just give a few minutes consideration to these two items. And if you're not sure, bring it up in a staff meeting so that everybody can discuss it openly. Firstly, a scenario for you. If you're in a school with younger children, such as a primary school, you may not think the first scenario applies to you, but unfortunately it does. I'm increasingly being made aware of these types of incidents, so here's the scenario. A student comes to you and says he or she has seen a naked image of one of the other students on a social network. This image looks like it's been shared and commented on widely. Through previous staff meetings, you're aware there have been concerns about this student in the past. What do you do? What would your actions be? Are those actions clearly laid down in policy which is widely shared and understood by everyone? Secondly, thinking about e-safety in the home context, many parents are turning to school for advice and guidance. What questions are you regularly asked by parents? Do you take note of these questions and share with other staff so that everybody can give the same advice? And do you feed that back to other parents as well, perhaps in your school newsletter or on your school Facebook page or perhaps your Twitter feed?